U.S. President Donald Trump has abruptly reversed course on a new trade relationship between Canada and China.
Fox News alert this morning, President Trump is threatening Canada with tariffs if the country makes a deal with China.
That's what he should be doing. I mean, it's a good thing for him to sign a trade deal. If you can get a deal with China, you should do that.
A 100% tariff threat sounds like dominance. In reality, it draws a map of dependence. As reported by Reuters, Donald Trump threatened a 100% tariff on all Canadian goods if Canada moves ahead with trade engagement involving China. On the surface, that looks like raw power, a warning meant to force alignment. But here's what most coverage is missing. If you test that threat against reality, it stops looking like a policy plan. It starts looking like a pressure test. Because the first plane wouldn't land in Ottawa. It would land in the United States. This isn't about whether tariffs are good or bad. It's not even really about China. It's about leverage, about who absorbs costs first, and about what happens when two economies are so tightly integrated that shock moves punish the sender as fast as the target. So the right question isn't, will Trump do this? The better question is, if he tried, where would it break first? By the end of this video, you'll know what's confirmed, what's theater, and where Canada actually has room to maneuver. No panic, no posturing, just the math. Let's separate what's confirmed from what's implied. First, the confirmed part. According to Reuters, President Trump publicly threatened a 100% tariff on all Canadian goods entering the United States. The condition attached was Canada's trade engagement with China. The message from Washington was blunt. Move in that direction and face extreme consequences. That's on the record. That's the fact pattern. There's also the political context. In the days before the threat, Prime Minister Mark Carney spoke at Davos. Shortly after, a dispute emerged over whether he had walked back those remarks in a phone call with Trump. Reuters and the Associated Press reported that Carney rejected that framing and stood by his public position. Those are the facts as reported. What we don't need to do is read minds. We don't need to label emotion as fact. But we can look at incentives in patterns. When a disagreement becomes public between leaders, what's often at stake isn't just policy detail. It's credibility. It's who gets to set the boundaries and who is expected to comply quietly. That doesn't prove motive, but it does suggest a signaling fight. And this is where many headlines misframe the story. They treat this as a trade dispute in the traditional sense, as if tariffs are being calibrated to fix an imbalance or enforce a rule. What's happening here looks different. This looks like a pressure test. Canada's response shouldn't be panic, and it shouldn't be chest thumping. The right posture is calm clarity. Treat this as a constraint problem. Keep options on the table within limits. Understand where leverage actually sits. Because once you do that, the 100% figure stops being the most important part of the story. So let's run the constraint map. Start with energy. This is where the numbers are cleanest. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, Canada is the dominant source of crude oil imports into the United States. In 2024, those imports averaged around 4.1 million barrels per day. No other country comes close. That matters for scale. Even a partial disruption would ripple through U.S. fuel markets. Analysts note that a sweeping tariff on Canadian energy would likely push costs through refineries and into consumer prices. Not on a distant timeline, quickly enough to become politically visible. It also matters for configuration. Industry analysts and studies have long pointed out that parts of the U.S. refining system are optimized for heavier crude streams like those coming from Canada. That doesn't mean substitution is impossible. It means it's costly, constrained, and not something you do overnight without consequences. Energy isn't a tap you turn off and replace at will. That's why a 100% tariff on Canadian energy would likely face immediate domestic pressure in the United States. From refiners, from fuel distributors, from state governments that see price spikes as a political problem, not a negotiating tactic. This isn't speculation. It's how the system is built. Now move to manufacturing. This is where integration really shows. More than 75% of Canada's exports go to the United States, according to Global Affairs Canada. But that statistic hides something more important. Much of that trade isn't finished goods crossing a border once. It's components moving back and forth through a shared production system. Auto parts are the clearest example. A single component can cross the Canada to US border multiple times before it ends up in a finished vehicle. The same is true for machinery and industrial equipment. Analysts warn that broad tariffs in this environment create compounding cost effects. Each crossing stacks costs on top of costs. What looks manageable on paper turns punitive in practice, not just for the exporter, for the producer trying to assemble a final product. Then come the critical inputs: aluminum, fertilizer. The C.D. Howe Institute estimates that Canada supplies over half of the aluminum available in the U.S. market. Aluminum isn't a niche input, it's foundational. Vehicles, construction, packaging, aerospace add potash. Data from Natural Resources Canada shows Canada as a major supplier to the U.S. fertilizer market. Industry groups emphasize that potash isn't easily substituted at scale without raising costs for farmers. Put these pieces together and a pattern emerges. A sweeping tariff doesn't isolate Canada. It detonates inside a shared production system. The first wave of pressure doesn't hit Ottawa. It hits U.S. manufacturers pricing contracts, U.S. farmers facing higher input costs, U.S. consumers paying more at the checkout. That's why this kind of tariff threat is so blunt. It doesn't target a problem. It tests tolerance. Now zoom out. There's a date on the calendar that matters more than the threat itself: July 1st, 2026. That's when the joint review of the Canada-United States-Mexico agreement is scheduled to begin. This review is built into the agreement by design. It's the moment when continuation, modification, or pressure becomes formalized. Why does that matter now? Because pressure tends to cluster ahead of real leverage points. As the review approaches, signaling intensifies. Lines are drawn earlier. Positions harden in advance. Seen through that lens, the 100% tariff threat reads less like a fully costed policy blueprint. It reads more like a preemptive pressure signal, an attempt to narrow Canada's room to maneuver before the institutional process begins in earnest. That doesn't make the threat harmless. It makes it legible. Layer that institutional reality on top of the energy and manufacturing constraints. A clear picture emerges. This isn't foreign trade in the traditional sense. It's a shared production system, operating inside a rules-based framework, with a ticking review clock. Shock moves inside systems like that don't demonstrate control. They expose friction. Now, none of this means Canada is immune. Canada's vulnerability is real. It's structural. Over 3/4 of Canadian exports still go to the United States. Much of that trade is embedded directly into U.S. supply chains. Reuters has reported that Canada's energy export exposure remains heavily U.S.-focused. Diversification is discussed. Options are explored, but those shifts are gradual by nature. So leverage here is not freedom, it's bargaining space. Canada can absorb pressure better than headlines suggest, but not without cost. That's why the smart response isn't triumphalism, it's discipline. Understanding where the system bends and where it breaks allows Ottawa to respond without overreacting, to keep options alive without pretending alternatives appear overnight. Mutual dependence doesn't eliminate risk, it redistributes it. Put all of this together, and the meaning of the threat changes. The tariff number is real. The escalation is real. But the leverage story is more complex. The constraints are real too. Escalation would likely create early pain in the United States through fuel markets, manufacturing costs, agricultural inputs. Canada still faces concentration risk because its export exposure remains heavily U.S.-weighted. That's mutual dependence, not one-sided dominance. From here, pressure gets more expensive. What happens next depends less on rhetoric and more on process. Watch the USMCA review calendar. Watch how publicly Canada signals its options. Watch how carefully it stays within limits. This moment doesn't prove Canada is untouchable. It shows that pressure politics only work when the other side has nowhere else to turn. Right now, the constraints suggest that space still exists. That changes the math. If you value calm, fact-driven analysis of how Canada navigates pressure from global powers, subscribe to this channel. Like this video so it reaches people who want clarity, not noise. And stay with us because as the USMCA review approaches, this story is only getting more consequential.